Widow Mine nerfs, a bunch of Protoss buffs, Zerg changes, and then we also have a strange new set of maps. So I literally just woke up after sleeping for about half a day. I flew in from the States yesterday. Very short trip. I flew out on Sunday and then I came back again yesterday, which was Wednesday, but now it's actually Friday, but because of the time zone. Anyways, things get very confusing. I was incredibly tired and I had actually already prepared a video in advance for today, so I guess I'll be posting that tomorrow instead. However, I woke up to a new StarCraft 2 patch that seemingly came out of nowhere. Now, of course, right now we are, other than the GSL Code S, in between competitive seasons in StarCraft 2. The thing about the GSL is that it lasts for, I think this time around, like 6 weeks or so it's quite difficult to plan around it. Either way, this should be a very interesting set of changes. Let us go ahead and have a quick little look. So, currently, this is the 5.0.13 PTR patch. What that means is that this is the public test realm. I don't know why we call it a realm. I guess that's because of World of Warcraft, because I think they have PTRs in there. Anyways, the PTR, the public test server, that means that this is not currently live in the game just yet. But generally speaking, the way that PTRs work in SC2 is that stuff gets tested, and if there's no bugs, we're just gonna publish it exactly as is listed right over here in this set of notes. Now, I want to start quickly with the map pool update, specifically for 1 versus 1. So they say we would like to thank our partners at ESL, the Balanced Community Council, and the community map makers for all their contributions. Right. There's a bunch of new stuff for 2v2, 3v3, and 4v4 as well. I'll go ahead and post a link to this set of patch changes down below in the description of this video as well, because I specifically want to go over the changes that are relevant to 1 versus 1, because that is what I'm personally most familiar with and what 99% of the players, well, at the very least, the viewers seem to enjoy. But before we have a look at that, a message from today's video sponsor. I know, Loko with a sponsored video? That's crazy. That doesn't really happen all too often. Today, I want to tell you more about a game called Unicorn Overlord. This game reminds me a lot of the classic 16 and 32-bit RPGs that I used to play a lot when I was younger, but with a much more modern aesthetic. It is developed by the Japanese studio Vanillaware, which has also developed games like, for example, 13 Sentinels and Odin Sphere. Now, Unicorn Overlord, it's a new tactical RPG where players can travel in a vibrant world, perform heroic deeds, and grow renown throughout the 5 nations. You can create an army with over 60 unique characters, from humans and elves to massive beasts and angels. Now, there's a free demo available in the link down below, and if you decide to pick up the game afterwards, your demo progress carries over to the full release of the game, which is pretty neat. Unicorn Overlord is available physically as well as digitally for the Switch, Xbox X, and the PlayStation 5, but you can also pick it up for the Xbox S and PlayStation 4 in a digital format if you're interested. Check out the link down below in the description of this video. Alright, so first off, the 1 versus 1 maps. For the very first time in the current season of StarCraft 2, we've got 9 maps in the competitive map pool. Historically in StarCraft 2, for the first decade and a half or so that the game has been around for, which is kind of insane. I mean, we're not quite at a decade and a half yet. Anyways, for the very first time, we've got 9 maps. Historically, we've always had 7. It looks like with the upcoming map pool, we're gonna stick with 9, which I think is excellent. One of the best changes we've made in recent memory is simply increasing the amount of maps. Now, obviously that means that some maps are going to be bad for Terran, Protoss, or Zerg. That's just kind of the nature of things. But because we have more maps and because players will have more vetoes, we will have more varieties in the different flavors of maps that are available. And the maps that are new are also very wild. I'll show you those in just a minute. The ones that get to stay from the previous season are the ones that are considered to be the best. So Golden Aura, Site Delta, Oceanborn, as well as Alcyone, Alcyone, whatever. Some of these maps have weird pronunciations, okay? It's gonna get better, I guess, with the upcoming map pool. Either way, those maps, they get to stay for another season, which is fair enough. What that means is that Equilibrium is out. That's that really big white map that's really good for Zerg. Heartlet is out. Hecate is out. Raduset Station, that is the really strange map that's really good for Protoss. Generally not really played very often. And Solaris also does not get to stick around for another season. Alrighty, so the first new map is called Post Youth, and this map is weird. Look at this. I mean, I guess I can show you right here with the camera mod. This is a main base that looks like a 2v2 map, because there is literally a secondary base in... Is this good? I don't know. There's a ramp that leads down towards the low ground. There's like a secondary ramp right over there as well with a bunch of mineral fields that can be mined out. Relatively natural, I mean, I guess we could call that the natural, but relatively normal natural expansion. And then there are some golden minerals over here as well with a hole in them. Generally speaking, this is a map that is going to require a ton of experimentation because it's all very, very strange. There are watchtowers on this map, so there's 2 of them, but they're both blocked off with a bunch of rocks. So you're going to have to... This alone would already be kind of strange. But the fact that there is a second base inside of the main base is really wild. Plus the fact that it's got 3 golden mineral fields. So obviously this is not your regular 8-field mineral base. But since 3 of them are gold, and there are 2 gases, you're going to be able to get a lot of income. And then, honestly, this expansion over here, the one that I guess normally would be considered the natural, it really feels far away. So the map is made by Depressed One. It's got a double main base, and then there is what he calls a lack of a natural expansion. I guess, yeah, since it's quite far away, you could not, yeah, I don't think you would necessarily call this the natural. It's a wild one, for sure. Next up, we have a map called Amphion. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's made by May on Fire. Now, by the way, all of the maps that are new, they are from the Team Liquid map contests, meaning that they have already been played on, they have already been judged, and pro gamers have already tested them. That's not to say that necessarily all of them are going to be amazing, but at the very least, it is not just a random set of maps that they found somewhere in the melee category in-game, you know? Like, these are maps that are made very seriously, and there's no denying that this one is also a little bit funky. So, we have the main base over here, we have a regular natural with a regular wall off right over there at the front, and I guess what we can consider to be, yeah, conventional expansions in the further reaches of the map. Looks like there's a hybrid base right over there. I believe there's another one as well all the way over here on the left. That doesn't really matter all too much. Hybrid bases, by the way, are the ones with both golden as well as regular mineral fields. This base right over here is a pocket expansion that is relatively easy to acquire if you decide to go ahead and mine out these mineral fields over here. The problem is that that is the only way in which to acquire it early on, because you cannot actually send a worker there straight up. You have to either, well, mine out those minerals or destroy the rocks. There's minerals right over here as well on the opponent's side of the map. So I guess if they end up mining out theirs, suddenly, yeah, if you decide to take yours as well, suddenly this becomes very exposed. It's an interesting layout, and again, it's something that we can really only figure out with pro gamers playing on them. Next up is a map made by Monitor called Crimson Court. Now, I must not be the only one who thinks of that absolutely horrendous Darkest Dungeon expansion called... It was actually pretty good, but once the entire troop ended up getting the Crimson Curse, you just fell apart. Anyways, Crimson Court, that is the name of the map. Relatively normal map compared to at least the other ones that we have seen so far, although this has what Monitor calls island bases. So the island bases are these ones right over here that are hidden behind these mineral walls. And again, they're only accessible either by, well, destroying a bunch of rocks or by mining out a bunch of resources. So again, if I show you a little bit more clearly, I think the reason why he calls them island bases, well, first off, in StarCraft 2's history, back in the early days, we used to have island bases, right? Those were bases that were off to the corner and obviously completely disconnected, like islands, right? So you could not be able to get there with any ground units. The problem is that that is incredibly good for Terran in particular, because command centers can fly. So Terran players always were big fans of island bases, everybody else hated playing on them. So these kind of feel like island bases, but they're still accessible by ground. I think that's probably the reason why Monitor calls them, well, quote-unquote island bases. Next up, we have a map called Dynasty, or Dynasty, I guess, depends on where you're from. This particular map is made by Agathon, and it has a backdoor expansion, right? So this alone is already a little bit weird. So there's a regular natural right over here, and then a backdoor expansion. However, it's got 2 gases. One right over here that's a regular conventional gas geyser, and then one right over here that is a rich Vespian geyser. What this means is that you could take this base early and make use of it relatively easily and, well, treat it as a regular base with a single gas geyser. However, you can also save it, I guess, and use it a little bit later, expand from there into that particular location, down through the center, and then eventually down all the way to the bottom of the map, where you can make use of a, rich Vespian geyser instead. Other than that, the map feels relatively small to me, but that's only because, well, I haven't seen any games on it yet. It's certainly an interesting layout, and again, very pretty. I haven't actually highlighted that yet. It's almost like we've gotten used to it, but the StarCraft 2 maps that have come out over like the last 5 years, all of them, really, really nice. Not just... So in the past, we used to have maps that looked really good, but some of them were very dark, and I was never really... Especially as a player, I think it's kind of annoying. I remember there was one map in particular called Acolyte. Cool map, definitely looked pretty, but whenever I played Zerg versus Zerg on it, I literally could not figure out which units were mine and which ones were my opponent. And in a fast-moving matchup, like for example ZVZ, very handy to know which units are yours. I like that these maps are all very bright, but at the same time still very detailed and yeah, with some solid color schemes, right? Nothing all too flashy, but at the same time all very recognizable. Lastly, we have a map named Ghost River, and Ghost River is made by Maris. Regular natural expansion right over here, regular third base. Not a whole lot of options as far as your expansion layouts go, so that is something that we have to take into consideration, because you're basically always forced to take this as your third base, meaning that your opponent can quite easily block it. I also don't see any Overlord pillars or anything like that in this section of the... Oh, there's one right over here. But nothing close to the natural. I guess you can maybe still hang out your Overlord in there. Anyways, doesn't really matter all too much, but the expansion pattern does seem kind of set. There's no option to, for example, expand in the direction of where your opponent spawned. Now again, much like, I think it was Amphion that we saw earlier, the map is top left to top right. So I think on Amphion it was bottom left to top left. But anyways, rather than being, you know, diagonal spawn locations, this map also has spawn locations that are a little bit different. But unlike Amphion, I don't think the rush distance from base to base is necessarily significantly quicker by air than it would be by ground, because you can just simply send units straight from your natural expansion down this ramp, up this ramp, towards your opponent's natural. Like, this seems a map that is gonna be very cheesy. Because, obviously, again, I haven't seen any games on it yet. Maybe I have, a long time ago. Not any recent games, anyways. I can imagine that this is gonna be a map where you can get to the other side of the map much quicker than you would be able to conventionally. So, I'm testing it right now. I'm running a drone from the main ramp on the right side of the map towards the main ramp on the left side of the map. I think this is gonna come down to about, I started running it at 3 minutes. Okay, it's about 28 seconds, yeah. So, regular maps these days, I think they have a rush distance of anywhere between like 30 to maybe like 34 seconds. Yeah, it's actually not quite as low as I thought it was gonna be, but it's certainly a quicker rush to get towards the other side of the map than on some of these others. Okay, so, next up, let us have a look at the general changes made to the game. So first off, the worker attack range has been increased from 0.1 to 0.2, and the worker's inner radius, the collision with terrain and structures, has been reduced from 0.375 to 0.3125. I guess what this means is that for some maps that may be made, well, coming up in the future of StarCraft 2, you're gonna be able to, for example, create little slides like that, where workers can go down to the low ground, but I guess units like the Reaper are a little bit too large to use that same slide. I don't think it's relevant for the current maps in the current, or I guess the upcoming map pool. I don't think it's relevant for any of those, but this is certainly gonna create some more variety. And I think the same can be said right over here for this change right over here. So we also have another one, apparently, reduce the footprint size in Vespian geysers. Okay, I guess that's also with map makers in mind. We have these things called Zerg rocks. They now lose HP off creep. Okay, so this is kind of cool. So one of the new features that we have seen in new maps in StarCraft 2, so again, there's map tournaments going on where people basically just make maps, and then there's a bunch of judges and pro gamers get to play on them, and usually there's money on the line. Anyways, long story short, one of the map features that pro gamers and pro map makers have been playing with lately is spawning pools. So basically the map spawns with like spawning pools that have a certain amount of HP. Now, obviously, Zerg structures lose HP over time when they are off creep. Meaning that map makers have basically, they've got like fixed timers, right? So say you give a structure 250 hit points at the start of a map, you can have it lose HP over time, at which point that section of the map opens up when the structure eventually dies. I don't know if Zerg rocks can be kept alive. Apparently that's what they're called. I don't know if these can be kept alive by creep. So say you're a Zerg player and you spread creep in that direction. Will that wall actually maintain? Will it actually just stay there? I'm not sure exactly if that's going to be beneficial for Zerg players at all. But this is definitely a lot more elegant, right? Zerg rocks, apparently. It's a lot more elegant than those, spawning pools that slowly lose HP. Because I think it's a really cool map feature. But the previous iteration of it just looked, a little amateurish. So this is going to look a lot nicer. And then we also have this thing over here. Mineral fields now all have 500 hit points that can, I guess, only be killed by collapsible rock towers. So again, something that would be cool for map makers, where I guess you can try and destroy your opponent's economy, literally? Okay. So generally speaking, when it comes to StarCraft 2's balance right now, the game is at a point where I think we can really only make minor adjustments. Obviously, there are some units that can be reworked because they are not very commonly used, but StarCraft 2 balance is very delicate. If you make any significant changes, it's going to affect every aspect of the game, right? Other than maybe the mirror matchups, because those are a little bit funky in general. I mean, you can nerf Zerg 10 times, and the mirror matchup, Zerg versus Zerg, is still going to have, well, same win rates as it's got right now, right? With a Zerg player winning 100% of the time. Anyways, what I'm trying to say is that one of the things that I see coming up from community members all the time is very significant balance suggestions. And I don't think you can really get away with that in 2024 anymore, unless there's like quick iterations that can be done. But obviously, since Blizzard doesn't really actively work on the game anymore, it seems like the turnaround time for certain things that are updated can be quite slow. So I think if you're going to do significant changes, you need to have your finger on the pulse and actually make adjustments, as things go on. So I'm pretty happy to see the set of changes that we've got right here overall. Now, with all of that being said, what are the main things that people complain about right now? Overall, Terran versus Protoss at the absolute highest level of the game seems to be a little bit Terran favored, especially in the sense that the easiest way to explain this, Terran versus Protoss, if Terran has a rough early game, usually you transition to the mid game. If Protoss has a rough early game, it's game over, right? That seems to be the general gist of it. And obviously, that's a little black and white. It doesn't really quite work out like that, but Protoss early game feels extremely delicate, especially compared to Terran. One of the problems you run into, for example, is the Widowmine drops. Widowmines in general, very annoying. And obviously, Terran has 17 different openers that are all viable. Whereas for Protoss, it kind of feels like you can only really go into Blink Stalkers and really only into a bunch of Phoenixes, right? Like there's a couple different varieties. Anyways, I'm going off on a tangent here, but let us read the changes. So first off, we've got the Advanced Ballistics upgrade for the Liberator. Its range bonus has been reduced from 3 to 2. Now, that has nothing to do with Terran versus Protoss early game, but this has everything to do with Terran versus Protoss late game. One of the things that's quite tricky for Protoss is transition from Blink Stalkers into, for example, Tempest. Tempests are a good counter against Liberators, but getting there is tough. Liberators overall feel a little bit overtuned, especially when you are stuck on a ground-based army. So, say you fall behind in the mid-game as Protoss, it's difficult to make that transition towards a reliable Liberator counter, but you still obviously have your Blink Stalkers from the earlier stages of the game. And this is going to make those Blink Stalkers more manageable. I wouldn't say they're going to be preferable necessarily, but it's going to be a lot more manageable against that mass Liberator style that Terrans like to go for. I think this is a very good change. Obviously, this is going to impact Terran versus Zerg as well. I don't think it really is going to make that much of a difference in that matchup because generally speaking, we are going to see Corruptors coming up anyways to deal with this. I don't really see how that's going to make that big of an adjustment, but one less range, certainly something that is worth noting. I think it's going to help out Protoss quite a bit. Secondly, the Widowmine. Now, this is a big one. This is probably the most disliked unit in the entire game. From both viewers as well as StarCraft players as well as pro gamers. Even Terran players don't necessarily love Widowmines, okay? There's a couple of things about the Widowmine. First off, it is annoying to deal with when it's dropped in your base, right? So obviously when it's dropped in your base, it is one of those things where if you don't pay attention, you may just lose the game. Especially early on, again against Protoss. They don't have a lot of units, Protoss usually, so you have to be in the right position at the right time. Widowmine drops can just end the game. Secondly, though, and maybe more importantly, in the later stages of the game, the Widowmine is a very attention effective unit. And what I mean with that is that it's one of those things where, and there's lots of options like this in the game, and lots of examples like this in the game, but when you burrow a Widow Mine, that's it, right? Like you send the Widow Mine forward, that's one action, then you burrow it, that's a second action, right? So it's 2 actions to just randomly set off a Widow Mine somewhere in the map. However, for Terran, I guess Terran's not as relevant actually, because we don't really see it in that matchup. But for Protoss and for Zerg, to deal with burrowed Widow Mines, it takes a lot more. To a point where I think it's actually extremely difficult to deal with Widow Mines compared to executing Widow Mines. And again, there's loads of examples like that in the game right now where, for example, Banelings as well. Generally, you just attack move Banelings with your main army control group, and then Terran obviously has to micro against it. I think Widow Mines overall are just a little too easy to play, and they have too much game-ending potential. Another thing that they have is invisibility. Invisibility requiring you to obviously need a detector, either in the form of a observer or, for example, an overseer, or again, I guess for Terran, you could do scans or ravens or whatever. But anyways, this will be nerfed. So the invisibility while reloading now requires the drilling claws upgrade instead of an armory. The natural progression for Terran is to go from engineering base into an armory and then into more engineering bay upgrades. So you didn't even necessarily need to rush out the invisibility, right? You just make an armory, and suddenly your Widow Mines are cloaked, which is pretty sweet. This is a small nerf to the Widow Mine, but certainly very, very nice. I think overall, cloaked Widow Mines with an armory alone, it seemed a bit unnecessary anyways. Like, it's such a good unit overall, it really doesn't need it. So moving that to the Drilling Claws research, which is researched, of course, in the factory's tech lab, I think that's a good change, yes. Secondly, and this one's huge, that is what you've probably been staring at for a little while right now. The splash damage radius reduction goes from 1.75 to 1.5. That means that Widow Mines deal less splash damage. I think that's a good change overall. Again, very obnoxious unit. And obviously, Terran has, siege tanks, right? Like, say, for example, you want to aim for more splash damage. It's not a bad idea. Yeah, you have some options. Now, it gives an attack alert to enemies when burrowing in range of enemy units. What this means is that you get the attack notification as in, like, your workers are under attack, right? Or your army is under whatever, right? Like any of those attack notifications, you're gonna get that notification as it's burrowing in range of enemy units rather than as it fires. That's a big change, because that means you have a little bit of time to react. Now, it's only a very short amount of time, but it's better than what we had. Secondly, increased visibility of the targeting line. So notice the thicker red line right over here on that stalker. That is because it now is easier to see. Overall, relatively significant changes here to the Widow Mine. Yeah. I think especially the splash damage is going to be very noticeable against Zealots and against clumped up units in general. My only concern with this change is that it's going to affect Terran versus Zerg as well, right? And obviously in Link Bane battles, we have had many games that are decided by big Baneling connections and likewise with big Widow Mine connections. The Terran side of things is gonna be weaker. It is simply gonna be weaker than it is right now. This is a change that's significant for TVP, and I do think it's needed in Terran versus Protoss, but I'm not 100% sure if I love this, especially this one, in the Terran versus Zerg. Now, I'm a Zerg player myself, so yay, but I can imagine there are some concerns there. Overall, though, yeah, definitely, it's about time, right? I think we're about 5 years overdue on a Widow Mine change like this, and I am very excited to see how this plays out. Obviously, the splash damage reduction also is significant for early game Widow Mine drops. So say, for example, a medevac flies in and a bunch of Widow Mines drop, right? You can defend against that much easier because it doesn't deal quite as much splash damage. So if you don't pay attention, you shouldn't just lose everything. Armory, cost reduced. So it's a 50 gas reduction right here from 150-100 to 150-50. This is, I guess, to maybe counteract some of that power moving away, but it's also going to make it much easier for Terran players to transition towards, for example, 2-2 and 3-3. And I guess any mech upgrades. And actually, you may be able to pull mech builds off a little bit easier like this too. That's not really something I considered yet, but now that I'm thinking of it, I'm going to scroll away from that GIF. It's annoying. GIF? I don't know. Maybe it's a little bit easier now to transition from, your early game into full-on Terran mech because it does save you 50 gas. Yeah, something worth thinking about. Would be nice because Terran mech's still not the most popular unit composition, and I don't know if it should be, but it's certainly about 10 times less common than Terran bio, so maybe Terran mech is going to be easier to get started with. We have the engineering bay. Infantry weapon armor upgrades. So the cost of any of the upgrades there, they are changed from 100, 175, 250 to 100, 150, 200. So overall, infantry upgrades are cheaper. I'm not sure why, but okay. I guess it's now more in line with what Zerg and Protoss pay as well. This is a small bio buff, and I'm not convinced that, yeah, bio... Oh, what did I do? There you go. I'm not convinced that bio really needs a buff, but overall, I guess this is fine. It's relatively insignificant, but interesting change. Alrighty, the Cyclone. Now, obviously, the Cyclone with the most recent patch had a very significant set of changes, right? It got a complete rework. Weapon cooldown increased from 0.48 to 0.58. The lock-on now has a cooldown that is increased from 0 to 2.86. Damage bonus per weapon upgrade is increased from 1 to 2, so that is from the armory upgrade. So in the past, in the previous version of the Cyclone, you never really got a whole lot of benefits from those damage upgrades because most of your damage came from the lock-on ability. Now it's still gonna come from the lock-on ability, but since the new patch, so since the current one that we right now have, not this one, well, this one is still gonna have it too, but since the new patch, the latest patch that is live in SC2, Cyclones now also benefit from attacking upgrades with their lock-on ability. So they're gonna benefit from that a little bit more. The weapon now has turret tracking, it turns faster, and it has a removed damage point. This generally means that it should be easier to micro. And then the health has been increased from 110 to 130. Okay, so is this a buff? Is it a nerf? I guess it's gonna be different. Again, we have a new version of the Cyclone. The thing about the Cyclone is that it's one of those units that you can really only judge properly when you look at it in-game. Because right now, if you compare the current stats of the Cyclone, it's very reminiscent of a Hydralisk. So the current version of the Cyclone that we have in-game right now, as far as cost and supply and damage output and all that goes, is very similar to a Hydra. But obviously, it doesn't really play like a Hydra. I find it difficult to really judge if I... Yeah, consider this like a nerf or a buff overall. I think we're going to have to see it used in-game. I do think it's going to be a little bit weaker with early game pushes, but it's also going to be more microable. So if you're skilled, you can get more value out of it rather than, you know, you just attack moving it and hoping that it's going to deal damage. And then lastly, for the Terran, we have the Raven. The interference matrix can no longer target units that are already targeted or affected by interference matrix. What this means is that you cannot just like spam interference matrices on, for example, siege tanks, right? Or, for example, a Colossus. Maybe not so relevant over there, but in TVT sometimes we just saw repeated interference matrices sometimes, and that is obviously suboptimal. Alrighty, Zerg. Where is Zerg currently at? I think Zerg versus Terran is about 50-50. I think it's a very good matchup overall. My personal favorite at the moment. I think it's a great matchup to watch, but also to play. It's just very exciting. You have loads of different options. Basically every unit, other than maybe the Swarm Host or something. Even that one we see every once in a while, especially against Terran mech. Every unit seems to have its place, and there's a lot of tech transitions from both Terran and Zerg. It's a lot of fun. Zerg versus Protoss at the highest level is considered to be ever so slightly Protoss favorite now. What changed? Well, obviously we've got the new patch. A lot of that also has to do with maps, so I find it quite difficult to really judge if it's because of the current balance of the game or because of the maps. But I think overall, Zerg is in a pretty good spot, maybe slightly overtuned. A lot of that, though, like the problem with that is, right, if you look at just the statistics alone of Zerg winning, it's pretty Zerg favored. However, if you take Serral out of the equation, Zerg really doesn't look that powerful in main tournaments, in Premier StarCraft 2 events. So it's always difficult to judge whether or not it's the strength of a race in StarCraft 2, or if it's, you know, statistical outliers. And right now, I think it's pretty obvious that Sero is the greatest StarCraft 2 player in the world. The man looks pretty much unstoppable. I think he would be equally powerful with Protoss and with Terran as well. I don't think it really has much to do with Zerg there, so you gotta take it with a grain of salt. Yes, if you look at only the statistics, Zerg does look a little overtuned, but as soon as you take the #1 performers out of every single race, suddenly Zerg doesn't look quite as powerful. Does that make any sense? I think that made sense in my head. Anyways, first off, the creep spread radius has been increased from 12 to 13. Okay, so this is for the hatchery, the lair, and the hive. That is the base amount of creep that's spread around a structure. Is that good? Is that bad? I mean, this is a buff. Is it significant? I don't think so. I guess maybe in Zerg versus Zerg, this would allow you to potentially sneak out a spine crawler on your opponent's creep a little easier? And on some maps, I guess some of the creep will reach to the natural expansion's wall of a little bit quicker. Or at least a little bit more comfortably. I don't think this has very significant gameplay implications, but okay. Yeah, there's got to be a reason why. I wish there was a little bit of information as to why, but cool. Next up, the Infestor. The Infestor's fungal growth range has been reverted back to 10, okay? The vision range, however, while burrowed, is reduced from 10 to 8. So, the fact that it had 10 range while burrowed was stupid anyways, right? Like, this has been... I think this is overdue. I think this is something that should have probably never been in the first place. The way we've been seeing Infestors used lately, and again, it's mostly Serral that is finding success with this. The other top-level Zergs, like, for example, Dark, for example, Solar, for example, Raynor, they don't really seem to get a lot of value out of just having, like, an Infestor sharking around the map and then hitting a fungal growth on a bunch of ghosts or something. They don't seem to get that much value out of it, but at least now the range is a little bit increased, and obviously the vision range is a little bit reduced, meaning that you have to be a bit more committed with your Infestors. The unburrow time has also been increased from 0.36 to 0.71. Sorry, no, the burrow time, I was going to say, I thought it was already those values. Unburrow time has been increased from 0.36 to 71 seconds to 0.54 to 0.7. Basically, what that means is that the unburrow time for the Infestor is now ever so slightly longer. So on the low end, from 0.36 to 0.54. What that means, I guess, primarily is that if you overextend with your Infestor, right, and you're just sort of sharking around your opponent's side of the map, you have to be a little bit more range, and you have to be a little bit more cautious with that fungal growth, which seems fair to me. And then the burrowed Infestor is now more visible while moving. This makes me wonder, though, who the Terran in this Balanced Council is right now, right? Who is specifically complaining about the burrowed Infestor usage that we see at the highest level. Because it's interesting to me, like, I've mentioned this many times, we never see Ravens in the late game. Ravens are mobile detectors. I know they are a little bit difficult to get out, but I feel like we haven't quite reached the 100% efficiency yet, you know what I mean? With Terran late game and that burrowed Infestor interaction. But before we get to that point, apparently we're going to get the Infestor, at least in that particular aspect of the game, slightly nerfed. Overall, though, like, if you're a regular run-of-the-mill Zerg, aka everybody below, like, those 4 names or so that I mentioned earlier, this is a small buff. Yeah, from 9 to 10 range. Although, again, this is not an easy unit to play in the first place. So, a lot of us, myself included, very frequently butcher our Infestor control. And 1 additional range is going to make it easier, but it's not going to make it easy. Next up, we have the Overlord. So the Transport Overlord morph time has been increased by about 3 seconds, okay? And then the Transport Overlord movement speed has been increased as well. This is, I don't think this one is particularly relevant, so there's a second update here as well for the Pneumatized Carapace Overlord. That one's going to be quick regardless. This is the upgraded version of the Transport Overlord, of the Dropperlord, but not upgraded with the Pneumatized Carapace speed research. Meaning that an unupgraded Overlord straight into a Dropperlord, yes, it's going to take 3 seconds longer to morph in, but it's also going to be a little bit quicker to move around. Like, obviously, it's still going to be slow, but I do think unupgraded Overlord drops may have a bit more potential. And one strategy we've seen a little bit as of late is Zerg players going Dropperlord into Nidus Worm. So you drop a bunch of Zerglings in your opponent's base, and then you pop a Nidus Worm right next to the Zerglings. And the idea behind that is that you can, well, defend against, like, say, for example, 4 Marines or 2 Zealots and a bunch of probes or whatever showing up to try and kill the worm before it spawns. Kind of a cool strat, and I think overall, that one's gonna have a bit more potential. Okay, next up, we have ourselves the Protoss updates. A relatively small list of changes. First off, though, this is gonna be a little bit difficult to discuss, but Protoss overall is considered to be the weakest race in the game right now. Protoss has not won a premier StarCraft 2 tournament in a very long time. It's been, I think, over 2 years now. The question is always, is this due to balance? Or is this due to the Protoss players just simply not being as good at the highest level of the game? And I think it's probably a little bit of both, if I'm being brutally honest with you. Here's the fact of the matter. Some of the very best Protoss players in the world, like for example CEST, like for example Trap, like for example Zaun, a whole bunch of the top tier contenders, they are off to the Korean not the Korean StarCraft 2 military, the Korean military service, right? So they have to do their military service. Maybe they'll come back at some point. That's always a little bit difficult to say. Sometimes pro gamers will never be able to get back to their previous level. And an example of that for Protoss is, for example, Stats. Stats used to be one of the greatest Protoss players in the world, and he's still very good. But he is not like a Bjorn level of good, right? Bjorn, Terran player who came back from the military, took him a while to get back to his former level, but he managed to get there. And players like, for example, Stats, and there's a couple examples like him, have not quite gotten back to previous shape. Secondly, besides some of the best Protoss players in the world not playing the game anymore or not quite playing at the same level anymore, there's the MaxSpecs situation. So MaxSpecs is the highest ranked Protoss in the world statistically on a Liga leg, but MaxSpecs refuses to play offline tournaments. Now, obviously, he can do whatever he likes. He doesn't have to play offline tournaments, but he doesn't. It reminds me, like, imagine what StarCraft 2 would be like if Serral did not play offline tournaments, right? Like, one player alone really can be a statistical outlier. Considering the fact that MaxSpecs regularly wins against the very best players in the world, he beats, for example, Clem all the time in the ESL Open Cups, I think somebody like MaxSpecs, at the very least, if he performs like 95% as well in offline tournaments, he would at the very least be top 4 in most premier events. But he doesn't. He doesn't play. So, all of that is to be said that, like, yes, Protoss is underperforming, but I'm also not 100% sure that it's due to balance. Now, obviously, since it has been a long time since Protoss has won a premier event, I wouldn't mind seeing more significant buffs. But the question is, do you want to keep buffing until Protoss wins 33% of the tournaments? Even though it's all a bit tricky, right? Like, it's a little bit delicate. Do we want, you know, mid-level Protoss players at the professional level to be able to beat top-level Terrans? Would that be okay? Like, do we really want them going 50-50? There's also the statistic, I guess, for Grandmaster League that is not quite as relevant, but for a long time now, about 50% of the StarCraft 2 spots in Grandmaster League are taken up by Protoss players. So on the latter, Protoss seems to perform very, very well. In Grandmaster League, Protoss seems to perform very well. It's just like the top 20 players or so. That is where Protoss seems to be brought to a halt. If I look back at, for example, Katowice, 2 Protoss players moved to the round of 12. One of them was Skillis. Skillis ended up getting 3-0'd by Dark. And then the second one was Hero, who got beaten by Cure. And I don't think either series really had any balance issues. Like, I don't think it's considered to be an upset that Skillis lost to Dark. And honestly, I casted that series between Hero and Cure. Hero is just not as stable. Like, there's weaknesses in his play, like, you know, the continued unit pulling from the wall off, right? Especially against Zerg. Drives me nuts. Yeah, I don't think that really had much to do with balance. Now, some people will say, yeah, maybe the Ghost needs to be weaker as well. That is something that's lacking in this list of changes for Terran. Honestly, that series, I don't think we had, like, maybe in the 5th game of that series, we had some Ghosts, but that was really about it. Anyways, I'm off on a bit of a tangent here again, but let us look at the actual changes. God, I started talking about this like 5 minutes ago. Protoss Observer. So, Observer, about 4 seconds reduced build time. Okay, a little bit less than that. Health has been increased slightly with 30 additional shields. And the model size has been increased and the surveillance mode animation speed has been increased as well. This means that it's easier to spot, but also a little bit more powerful and a little bit quicker to build. I think that's fair enough. Protoss in general, very blind. Difficult to get vision out on the map. I wouldn't even mind seeing the build time get reduced even more, but that is just me. It's certainly critical to have observers, but observers also are a little bit tricky to get out, right? So the fact that they're now a bit easier to produce, I don't know how much 10 HP is really going to make a difference. Maybe against like scanned, with like a bunch of Marines, right? When you scan as Terran, maybe it's a bit easier to get it out now. There may be one very specific interaction here that I'm currently not coming up with that may be a bit easier to protect against. But anyways, long story short, the Observer is a little bit more powerful, and I think that's fair enough. It will, however, also be easier to spot, so you do have to be cautious. The Sentry. The damage has been increased from 6 to 6 plus 4 versus shields. Okay, so it's going to be more powerful against shields, fair enough. And then secondly, the light attribute tag has been removed, meaning that certain units, like for example the Hellion, don't deal bonus damage anymore against the Sentry. The thing about the Sentry is that it's an expensive unit to produce, and it's quite flimsy. It is not going to be much less flimsy, and it's not going to be much more powerful, but it will be slightly more tanky and slightly more powerful. And then we have the Pylon. The sight range has been increased from 9 to 10. So this is, the vision radius around the pylon, right? So one thing we see quite a bit is Protoss players planting down pylons on the corners of the map or in the, perimeters of the outer sections of the map, and then they try to basically spot incoming medevacs or whatever, right? Maybe war prisms, that sort of thing. They scout incoming flying things, and that's going to be a bit easier to do. I think most of the Protoss improvements in this patch come from the Terran nerfs. Obviously, all of the changes here are relatively minor. Overall, though, I would say this is a slight set of nerfs right here for Terran, with a couple of buffs. I mean, the Engineering Bay buff, I guess, is maybe to make up for it, and the Armory buff maybe as well. Maybe it's going to make mech a little bit better overall, but it's a bit tricky to really judge. And it's about 50-50, right? I think the Widowmine is a clear nerf. Liberator, obviously, clear nerf as well. Cyclone, bit hard to call. For Zerg, the straight-up Infestor engagements are going to be slightly more powerful, but overall, the Infestor is going to be a little bit weaker. Maybe this is going to open up the Overlord change that is some more early game Overlord drop shenanigans that we haven't really seen Zerg explore with too much yet. And then overall, the Protoss changes here, all relatively minor, but it is going to be slight improvements across the board for Protoss. Okay, we have a whole lot of bug fixes as well that I haven't actually read yet. We can have a quick little look. So the Siege Tank turret now tracks previously attacked unit, okay. Fix an issue where the Siege Tank attack animation would sometimes not play. Fix an issue with the Reaper grenade charge animation. Fix an issue with the Ghost Snipe tooltip not showing bonus damage versus Psionic. Fix an issue where the Banelings could deal additional damage on the ramps. This is quite a funny change. I mentioned this in one of my previous videos that I've uploaded over like the last week, but basically, long story short, apparently sometimes Banelings would be existing on both a low ground as well as a high ground, according to the game. And then suddenly, it, on a ramp, would sometimes deal 50, or no, actually, it would do twice as much damage. Not 50% more damage, it would deal 100% more damage than it was supposed to, which is a crazy buff. So that issue has been fixed. Activating Generate Creep on Overlords now activates all of the selected Overlord types, okay. Lurker subgroup priority is now increased, now has a higher priority than a Ravager, okay. So that's a bit easier for all army enjoyers. Fixed an issue where Immortals would not fire while surrounded by units or covered by force fields. The Immortal turret now tracks the previously attacked unit. Fixes the tooltip on the Mothership's cloaking field buff, okay. Fixed various issues with recall. It no longer includes units that are already being recalled. So if you recalled towards the Nexus, and then at the same time recalled with the Mothership, it would go with the most recent recall. I didn't know that, but I don't see how relevant that really is. All recall abilities now cancel the Adept Psionic Transfer and Disruptor Purification Novas. Okay, fair enough. Feedback can no longer units with no energy. Can no longer, I guess, affect units with no energy. The Tempest Tectonic Destabilizer upgrade now also applies to attacks targeting flying buildings. Okay, so I guess this may be helpful that one time that the Terrans fly their command center to the corner of the map rather than leave the game, and you happen to have that research done. Fixed an issue where the Guardian Shield would not apply to units on a different cliff level than the Sentry. Fixed an issue where certain Vespasian geysers would not update visually when depleted. Fixed various issues with rocks appearance on the minimaps. And then also fixed various issues with healing shrines. Okay, so there we have it. Overall, a relatively small set of changes, I would say, but certainly a step in the right direction. Obviously, we are currently in a competitive season of the game. I mean, we're in between tournaments, but obviously the 2024 season is well underway at this point. And I think the balance of the game is solid overall with some slight underperformances for Protoss. New maps, some small improvements for the Terran versus Protoss, as well as, I guess, slight improvements maybe for the PvZ matchup. I think it's good. I like it. The most complained about unit in the game, the Widowmine, is receiving a bunch of nerfs. And again, the Cyclone is getting a rework after previously getting a rework. Those are the highlights for me. Let me know what you think about it down below in the comments section of the video. And whilst you're there, also make sure you hit the like button down below if you enjoyed it. This is a very rambly video, but I hope I still managed to get the point across of what this patch is all about. And if you enjoy these type of videos, feel free to let me know as well, actually. I'm always a bit hesitant to upload these, like, talk to the camera type of videos, because I know some people don't necessarily love them, but I guess you can just not watch. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Don't forget to smile. And I hope to see you once again tomorrow for another video.